Welcome back to the Legacy Ignited. Tonight's story will take you into the heart of a lonely cowboy's world, where one unexpected encounter in a dark barn will stir emotions, awaken secrets, and change everything you thought you knew. He thought his barn was empty that night, but in the shadows, a secret was waiting. A widowed cowboy, broken by loss, stumbled upon a little girl sleeping in the hut, alone, fragile, and clutching something she refused to let go of. Who was she, and why had she chosen his barn, out of all places, to hide? The prairie was wide, the night was cold, and danger was closer than he could imagine. Each heartbeat pulled him deeper into a mystery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about grief, love, and trust. This wasn't just a child seeking shelter. This was the beginning of a truth so painful, it would bring the toughest cowboy to his knees. What she carried with her was more than fear. It was a story soaked in secrets, in scars, and in a past that refused to stay buried. And when the truth finally came to light, it wouldn't just change her life, it would tear open his heart in ways he never thought possible. This is a story you will not forget. If stories like this touch your heart, make sure to subscribe and join our growing family here on Legacy Ignited. Every like and comment helps keep these powerful journeys alive, and I'd love to share many more with you. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped through the cracks of old wood and pressed against the heart like an unwanted reminder of loneliness. Daniel Hayes pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out of his small farmhouse, his boots crunching against the frozen dirt. The lantern in his hand swayed gently, casting long shadows across the empty yard. For years, nights had been like this, quiet, heavy, and merciless in their silence. A widowed cowboy who had lost both his wife and his will to dream, Daniel had grown used to the hollow echo of his own footsteps and the ache of unanswered prayers. But on this particular night, the silence wasn't quite the same. It felt watchful, as though something hidden in the dark was waiting for him. Daniel made his way toward the barn, intending only to check on his horses before retreating inside, to the empty house that had ceased to feel like home the day his wife passed. But as he pushed open the heavy barn doors, he froze. The horses shifted uneasily, their eyes wide, ears flicking at something unfamiliar. A faint sound, so fragile he almost thought he imagined it, floated through the hay-scented air. It wasn't the restless whinny of a horse or the scurrying of a mouse. It was the soft, steady breathing of a child. His lantern light swung across the stalls until it caught on a small figure curled in the hay. A little girl, no older than 8, dressed in rags that clung to her thin frame, her hair tangled and face smudged with dirt, lay sleeping as though the barn was her only refuge in the world. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For the moment, he just stood there, unable to move, unable to reconcile what he was seeing. She was so still, so fragile, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath the faint glow of the lantern. Every instinct in him screamed to step forward, to shake her awake and demand answers. Yet another part of him, a quieter part buried beneath years of grief, whispered that she had run to this barn for a reason. And in that moment, Daniel wasn't just a widowed cowboy anymore. He was a man standing on the edge of something that could shatter the life he had resigned himself to. He crouched down, careful not to startle her, his lantern resting on the dirt floor beside him. The girl stirred slightly, murmuring in her sleep, clutching a torn piece of cloth against her chest as if it were a treasure. Daniel leaned closer, and his heart clenched when he saw the faded stitching on the cloth. It was the corner of a quilt, the kind a mother would wrap her child in to keep the cold away. A fragment of family in the hands of a child who clearly had none. Questions thundered in his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why his barn, out of all places? But louder than the questions was the hollow ache in his chest, the one that had never healed since his wife's last breath. He had told himself he was done caring, done opening his heart, because it always ended in loss. Yet here, in the quiet of the barn, with a little girl asleep in his hay, Daniel felt something stir, a dangerous, fragile hope he didn't know how to handle. The girl shifted again, her eyes fluttering open. Wide, frightened eyes stared back at him, and for a moment, the barn seemed to hold its breath. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wooden wall, her small hands clutching the quilt piece like a shield. Daniel raised both hands slowly, his voice low and steady, the way a man speaks to a skittish colt. Easy there, little one. You're safe. But safety was not something she seemed to believe in. Her lips trembled as though words hovered there but refused to come out. She was mute with fear, and Daniel could feel the distance between them stretching wider with every heartbeat. He wanted to tell her he understood what it meant to be alone, what it meant to lose everything, but his own grief had stolen those words years ago. All he could do was keep his voice gentle, his presence steady. "You don't have to run, not tonight. Just rest. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The girl's eyes softened just slightly, the fight in them dimming though, not disappearing. She stayed pressed against the wall, but her breathing slowed, her tiny hands loosening their grip on the quilt. For Daniel, that was enough. He didn't push further. He simply sat there, the cold dirt seeping into his knees, and let the silence settle between them. It wasn't the heavy silence he had known for years. It was a fragile silence, filled with unspoken questions and the possibility of trust. Hours passed that felt like minutes. The lantern flickered, casting golden light over her tired face until her eyes grew heavy again. She fought it, blinking hard, but exhaustion won, and slowly her head drooped to the side, sleep reclaiming her fragile body. Daniel stayed there long after, watching over her as though keeping vigil over something sacred. For the first time in years, the barn didn't feel empty. Yet even as he sat there, a gnawing dread twisted in his gut. Children didn't just wander into barns on cold nights without reason. Somewhere out there was a story, a truth, that had driven this girl to seek shelter in a stranger's hay. And Daniel knew deep down that when that truth came to light, it wouldn't just change her life. It would tear open everything he thought he had buried, everything he thought he could live without. By the time dawn broke, Daniel's decision had already been made. Whether he wanted it or not, this little girl was now a part of his world, and he wasn't about to let her face it alone. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the truth waiting behind her frightened eyes would leave him, shaken to his very core, and force him to face the pain he had spent years running from. And nothing, not the quiet of the prairie or the weight of his grief, could have prepared him for what was coming. The morning sun crept through the cracks of the barn, painting long streaks of gold across the hay. Daniel sat on a wooden stool, his hat tilted low, his gaze never straying far from the small figure still curled in the corner. When the girl finally stirred, blinking against the light, she looked around as though she had forgotten where she was. Her eyes darted to him, wide with the same fear as before, but something in his steady presence kept her from bolting. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice rough from a night without sleep. "Mornin', little one." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a biscuit he had saved from supper. He must be hungry. He placed it on the ground halfway between them, careful not to move closer. The girl's gaze flickered to the biscuit, then back to him. Hunger won. Slowly, she crawled forward, snatched the biscuit, and retreated to her corner. She ate in small, desperate bites, crumbs falling into her lap, as if she feared someone might snatch it away. Watching her, Daniel's heart tightened. She reminded him of a colt born too early, fragile and uncertain of its place in the world. He wanted to ask her name, to know something about her, but the words felt heavy. Instead, he simply asked, "You got family around here?" The question stilled her completely. Her small hands froze mid-bite, and her eyes filled with something that looked a lot like sorrow. Slowly, she shook her head. Daniel felt his chest sink. Whatever her story was, it wasn't simple. Children didn't end up alone in barns unless they were running from something or someone. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself adjusting to a rhythm he hadn't known in years. Each morning, he brought food to the barn, bread, a bit of cheese, sometimes an apple, and each morning, the girl edged a little closer. She still didn't speak, not a single word, but her eyes began to soften when they met his. He learned the smallest details about her, the way she clutched that piece of quilt whenever she grew scared, how she always glanced toward the horizon before settling down, as though afraid someone might be coming for her. On the fourth day, Daniel returned from town with a pair of boots small enough to fit her feet. When he placed them near her, she touched them gently, as if they were made of glass. Then, for the first time, he saw the ghost of a smile flicker across her lips. It was fleeting, but it struck him harder than any storm. Yet with every fragile step forward, Daniel's unease grew. Folks in town had begun whispering. They asked why he was buying food in smaller portions, why he lingered at the general store, why he seemed less hollow-eyed than before. Rumors traveled fast on the prairie, and Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions he couldn't answer. That evening, as he returned to the barn, he noticed tracks near the edge of his land, boot prints, deep and purposeful, leading away from the fence line. His gut twisted. Someone had been watching. He rushed inside, his eyes scanning for the girl. She was there, huddled in the hay, clutching her quilt. Relief washed over him, but it didn't drown the fear. Whoever left those tracks wasn't far. That night, Daniel stayed awake, rifled across his lap, listening for sounds beyond the wind. The girl, perhaps sensing his tension, crept closer than she ever had before. She sat beside him in silence, her head leaning against his arm. For the first time since his wife's death, Daniel felt a warmth he thought he'd never feel again. A quiet reminder of what it meant to matter to someone. But peace was a fragile thing. The next morning, as Daniel went about his chores, a rider approached from the north. Dust trailed behind the horse, carrying a man whose sharp eyes searched the land like a predator. Daniel's jaw tightened as the rider slowed to a halt by the fence. "Morning," the stranger called, tipping his hat. "Name's Carter. I'm looking for a girl. Small thing, dark hair, might have wandered this way." His smile was too smooth, his gaze too cold. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He forced his voice steady. "Ain't seen anyone like that." Carter's eyes narrowed. He studied Daniel with the calculating patience of a man used to getting answers. "If you do, best let me know. She's got no business running off. Belongs with her kin." The word belongs rang hollow in Daniel's ears. Every instinct told him the man was lying. But Carter tipped his hat again, turned his horse, and rode off, leaving a trail of suspicion in his wake. Daniel returned to the barn, his chest heavy with dread. The girl was waiting, eyes wide, as though she had heard every word. When he knelt beside her, she finally spoke, her voice hoarse, trembling, but clear enough to break him. "Please, don't let him take me back." The words shattered the silence like glass. Daniel's breath caught, and for a moment, he couldn't move. She pressed the quilt to her chest, tears streaking her dirty cheeks. "He's not my kin," she whispered. "He hurts people." Daniel's blood ran cold. The truth he had been bracing for now stood before him, heavier than he could bear. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a girl running from a man who would stop at nothing to reclaim her. He took her small hand in his voice low but firm. "You're safe here, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, Daniel knew promises could be broken. Carter would return, and when he did, he wouldn't come with questions. He'd come with force. And Daniel Hayes, widowed cowboy or not, would have to decide just how much he was willing to risk to protect a child who had stumbled into his barn and, somehow, into his heart. And deep down, he knew the fight ahead would leave more than dust, and scars. It would drag truths from the shadows that neither he nor the girl were ready to face. The days that followed were heavy with dread. Daniel fortified the barn, kept his rifle close, and prayed for strength he hadn't asked for in years. The girl who finally whispered her name as Leela clung to him with a trust that cut deeper than any wound. She told him pieces of her, truth in broken words, fragments that painted a picture darker than the prairie nights. Carter wasn't kin. He was a man who had taken her after her parents died, a man who treated her worse than an animal. She had escaped, carrying nothing but the torn quilt her mother had once wrapped her in. Daniel listened, each word carving into his heart. He thought of his wife, how she had always wanted children, how fate had stolen that chance from them. And now here was Leela, a child battered by cruelty, seeking shelter in the one place where his own loneliness had reigned. He realized then that she wasn't just a guest in his barn, she was the answer to a prayer. He'd stopped praying, but Carter returned sooner than expected. One night, under a sky bruised with storm clouds, the sound of hooves thundered across the land. Daniel stepped out, rifle in hand, his heart pounding like a war drum. Carter dismounted, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Step aside, old man. She's mine." Lila clutched Daniel's coat from behind, trembling. Daniel's voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose. "She ain't yours. Not now. Not ever." The standoff stretched like a wire ready to snap. Then Carter's hand twitched toward his gun. Lightning split the sky. In that flash, Daniel saw his wife's face, remembered her laughter, her warmth, and knew what she would want him to do. He raised his rifle not as a weapon of anger, but as a shield of love and fired a warning shot into the dirt at Carter's feet. The horses spooked, rearing back. Carter cursed, but something in Daniel's eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't just defiance, it was a promise, the kind that could only come from a man who had lost everything and wasn't about to lose again. With a sneer, Carter swung onto his horse. This ain't over. He rode off into the storm, his shadow swallowed by the night. Daniel collapsed to his knees, the rifle slipping from his hands. Lila threw her arms around him, her small body shaking. In that moment, the dam he had built around his grief broke. Tears poured down his weathered face, not just for the wife he had lost, but for the child he had found. Months passed, and Carter never returned. Word spread, and eventually, the law came, taking his name off the land for crimes whispered but never proven. As for Daniel, he no longer walked alone. The farmhouse that had once been silent now echoed with Lila's laughter. He built her a bed, taught her to ride, and every night, before the fire, she wrapped herself in that torn quilt until sleep claimed her. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Lila placed the quilt on Daniel's lap. Mama said, "This was for family," she whispered. "Now it's yours too." Daniel pressed the fabric to his chest, his tears falling freely. For the first time since his wife's passing, he felt whole, not because the pain had gone, but because love had found him again in the unlikeliest of ways. And so, the widowed cowboy, who had once surrendered to grief, learned that sometimes the greatest truths don't break us, they mend us. And a little girl, who once slept in his barn, gave him back the one thing he thought was lost forever, a reason to live. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Become part of our journey by subscribing to Legacy Ignited. Every like, every comment, every share helps these stories reach more hearts and keep the spirit of hope alive. Together, we're not just listening to stories, we're building a community that carries them forward.